Good morning, everyone. It's Joker, and today we are back with another slime video. Now, last week we did damage testing videos with the new Milim and what individual buffs and how powerful they were, and that was a science video. Today we're going to do another educational science video, and this is mainly geared towards newer players who some of the aspects of the damage potential of this game can be a little bit convoluted as far as what works with what and how and why this doesn't work. So today I'm going to try and clear up a lot of those answers, maybe not every single answer, but I do want to give just a lot of different examples of how you can make damage buffs work and how some damage buffs can be held and some cannot, and how to do that in the first place. So we're just going to make another educational video today, again using the Tempest, or not the Tempest Elite, but the Exalted Champions team as a prime example because it has just a lot of buffs that we can work out of. So with that said, let's just start with the examples as a whole. All right, so one of the biggest questions that I always see from newer players is, how do you know when a buff can stack with another buff of the same type? And it's very, very simple. It's all based on the wording. So we have Primal Demon Space Blanc here, right? She gives herself on this skill a 15% attack buff. So if we look at her stats right now, she is at literally nothing. So if we use this skill, it's for free. It is an unlimited 15%, which means you can continue to stack it over and over and over and over and over again. So now we go back and look at her, and we have now a 15% attack buff that says forever. Now, there are forever unlimited buffs, and there are temporary buffs, whether they be 1 turn, 2 turns, 3 turns, they will go away eventually. Those types of skills will not stack with each other. So a temporary and a temporary buff, whether it's 1 turn versus 3 turn, they will not stack together. It will take the highest percentage one over the lower percentage one. A temporary and an unlimited buff, however, will stack together. So we have the new Rimuru with a 70% attack buff right here, right? So we can go ahead and apply that. And now if we look at Blanc, she has her 15% attack, and she has a 70% attack for 1 turn. So right now, this is an 85% attack buff. We also have Light Milim, who is an older character, but she also raises attack by 45% for 1 turn. So if we apply that, and now look at Blanc, we can see that this 45% is lower than the 70. They're both 1 turn. They do not work together. This one is grayed out because they're temporary buffs, and this one is higher. So if we were to just do the 45 and the 15, that would work together just fine. That would be 60%, because one is forever and one is a turn limited buff. But 2 turn limited buffs of the same exact type do not stack together. So when you're looking for buffs, you want to make sure that you're not, overlapping things that are already being applied to the team. Because if you want to bring like these 2 light characters right here, yeah, you could technically. It wouldn't be very point efficient, though, because you're already getting a higher buff from Rimuru than what Milim's doing. So you might as well bring a character who is not going to bring the same kind of buff and use like a crit buff or a pierce buff or synergy buff or something like that. You don't want to, keep on trying to stack temporaries when they don't actually work together. But you can stack forever buffs. So if we go another turn or so and do this, so we let this turn play out, we can then next turn use another stack of Blanc, and that 15 is now 30. But because both of these skills have run their course now, they're no longer applicable right now. So boom. Okay, so now Blanc is up to 30% attack. And if we were to apply the Rimuru buff of 70, it would now be 100%, because the forever buff and the temporary buff work together. Alright, the next thing I want to show you guys is how to hold buffs in the back. And by that, I mean using a temporary buff for a character and then moving them into the back line. And if you do that for certain skills, they will last. So like this Rimuru's 1 turn attack buff right here, if you were to leave Milim up front, it would, end, right? Because it's only for 1 turn. But if I were to apply it now, and then send Milim away, because this is a buff that affects and is put on the character themselves, it does not count as a turn of that skill being used if they are not up front for said skill to be used. So let's send Milim to the back. Let's do just this random hand right here, and then we can bring Milim back in next turn, where, normally the attack buff has now passed. As you can see from Rimuru, his attack buff is now gone. Like, his 70% attack buff is done. But if we bring Milim back in now, we can see that we still have the temporary 1-turn 70% attack buff, because she's not actually been active for a turn for this to be used and then deleted. So being able to hold certain buffs in the back is very, very important to building up your nuking potential, because obviously with this team, you are limited to how many points you can use in a turn. And a lot of the times, if you really, really want a big mommy nuke, you're going to need some expensive buffs, or at least more buffs than what you're going to have access to. So being able to hold these things on a character, send them away until you're ready to use literally every skill available, is a very, very good, viable option that you should always attempt to do. So here, we have Milim's buff. 100% ult damage and 100% weakness strike. Half of this you can hold, because only half of it applies to the character themselves, right? So actually, this was a bad time to use it. Let me come back. Okay, now we actually have an ult, so this, you can actually see the example. So here, we have Milim's personal weakness strike buff and personal ult damage buff. So let's go ahead and use that now. The weakness strike is a buff that is applied to Milim herself, as exemplified here. She has it attached to her. 100% weakness strike. Because it shows up in this list of buffs, if we are to move Milim to the back and bring her back on turn 4, she will still have that 100% weakness strike, because it hasn't been active for a turn. But the other part of her skill is 100% ult damage. And as you can see, that is not in her skill description right here, her effect list, because it's applied to the ult orb itself. 100% right here. This buff will not carry over into the back, and it will not be held for the next turn, or the turn after, or whatever, however many turns you decide to leave Milim in the back, because it is applied to the orb. The orb has a different set schedule and rotation and timing of the character itself. So, if we go ahead and move her to the back now, and we send this one orb right now, we can see next turn that we will still have the weakness strike, but we will not have the ult damage, because the orb does not get carried over into the back. Even though we, removed it from the hand, it does not matter. It does not count in that way. So let's bring you in for Veldora, that way we can actually have an orb, and you can see now that the orb does not have that 100%, but Milim's character still does have that 100% weakness strike. So a buff that applies to only an orb cannot be carried over and held in the back. The same way that if we use the Masked Hero right here, right? If we were to do her skill, which is 50% orb damage, all souls, so boom, now the greens, the oranges, the blues, they all have this attack buff right here, 50%. And if we were to move Milim again to the back, we can't really, but if we could, this is a one-turn thing. And because it applies to the orb, it also will not be saved. And it's active for one turn, right? This is the turn. We used one orb, okay. The damage buff is now gone. And now the weakness strike, because we left Milim up front, is also gone. So holding buffs only works for skills that affect the character themselves. Attack buff, weakness strike, element buff from Velzard, like we can do this. The Drago effect, because it is an effect that is applied to the character themselves and is listed in the effect list down here. These things can be held in the back, so again, we'll swap Milim out, we'll send this one orb, and then on turn 6, we will still have access to that element buff, even though she exists in the back right now. So you can see that Guy and Hero, they have now lost that buff, but Milim, you can see right here, she still has it. We don't have an orb for her, but she still has the every single element buff plus the Drago, because it was not active for a turn existing in the back. All right, here's another few examples of what's going to happen if we do this. So let's bring in Hinata for Nabe. This is the Overlord Rimuru team. He stacks all element attack by 10% unlimited, so you could do as many of these as you can. And as you can see on Ainz, we have his EX alt, and we have 5 stacks of the element buff from Rimuru, so we're 50% right now. Hinata gives a temporary, 1-turn, 50% all element buff. So because Rimuru is stacking forever and Hinata is a 1-turn, we can apply this, and now it's going to be technically 100 because we have the 50 here and then we have the 50 here, differentiated by the forever buff versus the turn remaining 1 buff. So Ainz is dark, so we have a dark attack 55 because it's part of the protection as well, so it's 50, and then we have the dark attack 50% right here for 1 turn. And if we were to move Ainz to the back, we would also be able to hold onto that temporary buff while keeping, the stacks. And on top of that, we're going to use the crit, and we're going to use Shizu's buff as well. So what this does is now Ainz, on top of having the 50% element plus the 5 stacks, he now has guaranteed crits and 70% magic attack and 100% weakness strike. Okay. These will all be held in the back if we move him like so. Now, the thing that won't apply is this alt resistance down. It's a 1-turn debuff. It's on the enemy. There's nothing we can do about that. It will run its course on this turn, and then on turn 7, it will go away, unless we reuse the skill again. Also, with Shoutir's alt damage, as we proved the previous clip, if we use it now, it's going to do jack crap, because 1, there is no alt, and 2, it's a 1-turn buff that does not get held in the back. So we can use it as an example, sure, but next turn, because Ainz is in the back, doesn't mean anything, because this is a skill that buffs in orb, not the character. So we do this. Alright, good, he didn't die. Perfect. And now, see the alt here? Alt attack, the arrow, and the sword, and then now it's gone. And even if we bring Ainz back in for Hinata, he also does not have that attack buff on the alt buff. But he still maintains his 5 stacks of forever buff from Rimuru, his 50% element buff temporary from Hinata, his magic attack, his weakness strike, and his guaranteed crits if he wasn't sealed. Unfortunately, it's right here, but this is a separate thing. So we can still nuke, and we can get a whole butt ton of damage out of this, because we've got 4 or 5 different buffs going on that are all doing mostly different things, except for the stack on the stack, right? So there's an example of, using a number of buffs. You don't have to use literally every skill in every turn, because some teams, you can't do that. There might be cheap buffs, but there is a limit to how many skills you can use. And so by recognizing the power of applying buffs early, sending the character away, and then bringing them back when you have another, 100, 150 points to use, and you can use the other half of the skills that you weren't able to the first time, you can maximize the amount of damage that you were able to do in the same number of turns without having to sacrifice orb continuity or something like that. Alright, the last example I want to give for this video is, not only are damage buffs a thing, but also orb effect buffs. So, there are things where, you use an orb change, you get 10% gauge increase here, or you get 10% there, you do something over here. These also can stack if they are doing different things. So right now, on this blue orb, we have the skill point increase by 500%. That's coming from Protector Velzar. That's what she does, is she stacks 100 to 500% skill point gain. We then have 20% gauge increase from the Charm. And you can see we've got it a number of times because we've used the Protector a lot. So we've got these 4 stacks, but only one of them is active because they're the same exact thing coming from the same exact place. They do not stack together. But we also have this alt gauge increase for orbs by 50%. This is a different effect than the skill point gain here and the protection gauge gain here. So it also works, therefore it's still active. And then we can apply an orb change from Guy. Now his skill gives 10% gauge for blues across the board. So if we go and look at the blues again, we now have 500, 20, 50, and now 10. because this is all gauge. Green's, skill point, protection gauge, and alt. It's covering all three. This buff right here is covering only alts. This buff right here is covering only protection gauge, and this buff is only covering skill point. Now, we also have a couple other characters back here. So we've got this Dark Xion, right? Her skill is gauge increased by 10%. So let's go ahead and use that. Now we have a full hand of blue, but because it's the same effect as what Guy did, it does not stack together. It's the same exact thing from a different skill, but it's the same effect. Does not stack. But if we do this, increases blue orb by 20% alt gauge, we apply this and go look at the blues again, it also does not take effect because it's already being overridden by Lumi's skill, which is 50%, which is obviously higher than 20. So different numbers, but the same exact effect means that we will always take the higher number. And then finally, apart from that, we have Milim over here, who can steal all blue orbs to herself and give her 20% gauge increase for ults. Alright, so now we have a full hand of Milim. We go and look back at the orb, and because it is the same effect as what Xion just did, and the same effect as what Lumi does, it also is not in effect right now. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 things going on for these orbs, but only 4 of them actually matter, because they are buffing individually separate gauges. All gauge increase, alt gauge increase, protection gauge increase, and skill point increase. Those are the 3 gauges that we cover in the game, right? Blue gauge for protection, alt gauge for, supers, alts, skill point gain for the skill points, right? If you cover all 3 at once, it will work. If you cover each one individually, they will also work. But trying to stack on multiple of the same buffs for orbs, just like trying to stack multiples of the same, damage buffs, they do not work, and it will always take the higher number that's available to them. So hopefully this video taught you something about stacking buffs and what does what and when and why and where. Let me know if this video helped you, or if you still have additional questions that I can either answer in the comments or in a separate video. But that's it for me, guys. Take it easy, and I'll see you all later.